So the motivation for this paper is quite simple. That in most countries of the world, you have the president appointing judges to the superior courts, or at least they have a very prominent role in the appointment procedure. Some examples are, of course, Russia, Bangladesh, Singapore, Nigeria, etc. But this seems counterintuitive to the whole idea of separation of powers and independence of judiciary. In fact, in L'Esprit de Loi, Montesquieu worried about presidential appointment of judges, and he said that this having any presidential influence or presidential role in judicial appointments will lead to subversion of separation of powers. Others disagreed. Most prominent among them were the founding fathers of the US, the Federalists, the writers of the US Constitution. For example, Federalist Paper 68, they defend presidential appointment of judges. And they say, well, if we have security of tenure, what they call continuance in office, then we will, even if we have presidential appointment, this will secure the separation of powers, and Montesquieu doesn't need to worry about this. So if the president can hire the judge, but not fire her, this will be enough to secure the separation of powers and independence of judiciary. Now, in this paper, I show this is unlikely to be true, that presidential appointment of judges exerts significant influence on judicial decision-making, judicial independence, and this may even have implications on decision quality. I also document the mechanisms that connect presidential appointment of judges with judicial decision-making. Now, I do this in the context of Pakistan, where a truly remarkable natural experiment allows us to test whether Montesquieu was right or Federalists were right in a way. So in 2010, the judge selection procedure of Pakistan suddenly changed from the president selecting judges, all levels of the court, for example, in Brazil or Nigeria, to appointment of judges by a judicial commission consisting of peer judges, like university professors are selected by their colleagues, or judges in UK, Sweden, or Greece are selected by peer appointments. Now, what is also interesting about this reform is only the appointment procedure changed. The clauses to remove the judges, Article 209 of the Constitution, how judges can be removed, remained the same. And the power of the judge, what the judge could do, also remained the same. So allowing us to really kind of study the selection effects or the selection change in selection procedure. Now, before I go into the details, I want to basically give you an overview of the main results. So what I find is that the move away from presidential appointment of judges to appointment by judge peers significantly reduces rulings in favor of the government. And this reduced ruling in favor of the government is suggestive of an improvement in the quality of judicial decisions. My identification comes from the staggered implementation of the reform that arises due to a mandatory retirement age law. In my investigation of mechanisms, I basically asked two broad questions. What are the types of judges driving the results? And what are the types of cases driving the results? Coming to what are the types of judges driving the results, it's fundamentally a question of what is the peer appointment selecting for? So what are the characteristics of judges under peer appointed judges and under presidential appointed judges? And what I find is that peer appointed judges are much less likely to have been politically active prior to the judicial appointments than judges appointed by the president. In fact, 35% of all variation among peer appointed judges is explained by just political activity prior to the judicial appointments. Second, what type of cases are driving this? Now, these turn out to be cases involving land expropriation by the state. Judges appointed by judge peers are significantly less likely to allow the government to expropriate private property with judicial impunity. And my estimates, based on my coefficient estimates and the value of land expropriations in these cases, suggest that selection reform prevents land expropriation worth about 0.14% of GDP every year. which is equivalent to about 400 million US dollars every year. So this may seem a small amount, but for a country like Pakistan, this is equivalent to the entire healthcare budget which the government of Pakistan allocated in 2019. So I will go briefly on what this paper relates to and what literature it speaks to. So broadly, it's speaking to three broad strands of literature. Principally, it's speaking to this literature on institutions and development. And within that literature, the focus on checks and balances. If you recall, the famous or influential Asamaglu, Robinson, and Johnson settler mortality study, their key instrument, their key explanatory variable, the measure of instrument, is the polity for measure of constraints on the executive. And why did they use it? They said this is the closest which we can come at the macro level to measure institutions. And for example, they cite Douglas North's definition that institutions are rules of the game that constrain human behavior and that constrain governments and individuals. So building on that, this paper is speaking to all those literature on constraints on the executive and institutions. This paper is also speaking to the literature on state capacity, effectiveness of the state, how public sector may be made more effective, and also the focus on presidential appointment of judges also means that it's focusing on this literature on political connections, clientelism, as well as how governance might be affected by political connections, etc. Thirdly, last but not the least, this paper is speaking to the literature on political selection. Now, Timothy Beasley, all these papers, primarily the focus in these papers has been on politicians. And the literature that does exist on judge selection focus on selection of judges via elections versus governor appointments, all focused in the United States. But now there is no issue of focusing on the United States, but for example, electing judges is a very rare form of judicial appointment. So it doesn't allow us to really learn a lot beyond other selection procedure which most countries use. So the first contribution of this paper is to basically study judge selection via presidential appointment versus judge selection versus judge peers. And the second contribution is to study how executive control over the judiciary sharply falls when one of the most widespread institutions in the world, the presidential appointment of judges, is discontinued. So in a way, the paper provides empirical support for the theory and mechanisms behind many of these influential studies on checks and balances. Last, the paper is also speaking to the literature on judicial independence in context of a developing country. This is a large developing country, Pakistan, where I'm focusing on. This is the fifth most populous country where studies are lacking, court data is extremely scarce, and democratic institutions have not really taken root, allowing us to really kind of understand, speak to this fundamental question in political economy, that what are the conditions for establishment of rule of law in societies, and how a selection procedure may be able to be a improvement, may cause some improvement in rule of law. So this is the roadmap of the presentation, rest of the presentation. I won't have time to go through all of the appendix and all the robustness checks that I did. I will just focus mostly on the text, the main point of the paper, the data, the empirical methodology, the mechanisms. But if you'll have any questions on the robustness of the results, different identification checks, I will be more than happy to answer them in the Q&A. So the data for this paper. So one of the key challenges of doing a paper like this is, of course, the huge data constraints which you face, especially in developing countries. You don't know, for example, you basically get ratings by experts on a country who are not inside the country on some measures of rule of law. So the key outcome variable here I use is from judgment texts. So these are decisions written down by judges. And this provides us case level micro data to measure judicial decisions. Now, this case level data is matched with judge level, judge characteristics data. Now, to have almost a perfect match of all cases with all judges, you have to basically combine three data sources, which is the registrar offices or data from registrar offices in the courts, which is basically judicial administrative data, annual reports which the lower courts submit to the Ministry of Justice, and also bar association records, which basically, because most of these judges were lawyers before they were judges, so the bar associations also keep very good detailed record of their characteristics. Finally, the case and judge level data is matched with the district level data, where I use population census and agriculture census, which I digitize as well. Now, this may seem all a bit vague. So I want to give you a concrete example. So this is how a data point looks like and how the matching is done. So this is a case of Syed Altaf Hussain, who's the plaintiff, and he has filed a case against the federal government of Pakistan. Now we know this case is about recovery of property like most other cases. The grievance of the plaintiff is that despite being owner of the house, the authorities had taken custody of the property. Now, about this case, we know that this is heard by Justice Nadeem Akhtar. This is before the court of Justice Nadeem Akhtar. And this case level data can be matched to judicial administrative data. And from judicial administrative data, we know that Justice Nadeem Akhtar was appointed on 20th March 2012 after the 2010 April reform. So we know he was appointed by Judge Pierce. What does he rule? He rules that authorities committed willful and deliberate breach of right to private property. The High Court directs the Federation to return the property to the rightful owner and pay damages basically in rent. And also the petition is accepted. Now, of course, I am going to argue that this case is illustrative of a broader and larger pattern. I'm going to provide empirical support to that. But before I do that, I think it's important to understand how we may try to proxy for judicial independence. Now, how to measure judicial independence? Measuring any judicial outcome is extremely challenging because, how do you measure justice, for example? So to overcome that or I mitigate it, I focus on all the cases where the citizen is poised against the state and construct a variable called state victories, which takes the value of 1 if the state wins and 0 if the state loses. This is a case level proxy for judicial independence. Now, I measure state victory variable in 2 ways. First, I ask a law firm to code the state victory variable as 1 and state defeats variable as 0 in all cases involving the state. Now, this is done very methodologically. The law firm consists of 2 teams, where one team of 4 lawyers, junior lawyers who just started practice, supervised by a senior lawyer with 10 years of experience practicing constitutional law, which is exactly the cases which are involved in government when government is involved in the case. So these 2 independent teams independently code this, whether after reading the text of the judgment order, whether the state won or lost. They also code some other decision quality variables, which I will come to later. But still, this may still be subjective. So I also cross-check this result by doing a literal phrase search in the text of the judgment order called "the case against the state is dismissed," in which case the state victory variable takes the value of 1. And when the petition, when the text of the judgment order contains "the case against the state is accepted," state victory variable takes the value of 0. In both instances, I obtain essentially identical results. Now, before I show you quantitative results, I also think it is important to qualitatively understand the kind of change I'm talking about when I think about this reform. Now, let's consider 2 cases, one before the reform and one after the reform. Now, before the reform, there was a case where it was ruled the president may, in the larger public interest, perform all legislative measures which are in accordance with or which could have been made under the Constitution, including the power to amend it. The petition is dismissed. What is remarkable about this judgment is like how much closely it is speaking to separation of powers. What is separation of powers? Separation of powers of legislature, judiciary, and executive. And here you are saying play havoc with the constitution. You can do what legislature does. So this is a kind of an extreme version of deterioration of separation of powers. Now let's consider another case after the reform, where it was ruled that the fortune amassed is indeed huge, and no plausible explanation has been advanced in that regard. Balzac may have been right after all when he had said that behind every great fortune for which one is at a loss to account for, there is a crime. The petition is accepted. Now, coming to the final paragraph of this judgment order, which is actually a 10-page judgment order, this is very interesting judgment decision. So when it says, the final paragraph says, the Election Commission of Pakistan shall issue a notification disqualifying Nawaz Sharif from being member of parliament with immediate effect, after which he shall cease to be the Prime Minister of Pakistan. In another case, you have a Prime Minister with 2/3 majority in the parliament, the biggest business tycoon in Pakistan, who is dismissed from office by the courts. Now, this pattern of higher state wins before the reform and lower state wins after the reform generalizes to a full sample of 7,500 cases. Before the reform, the state wins about 50% of the time. After the reform, the state wins about 40% of the time. The differences are both qualitatively significant and also statistically significant. Now, you may already be wondering that, of course, a lot of things are happening around the 2010 reform year. And most importantly, I think, what was happening before the reform year is dictatorship. In 2008, Pakistan transitioned from military rule to democratic rule, kind of democratic rule. So it is very possible that the high state wins we see here is entirely explained by the coercive power of the military apparatus. There were other things going on. In 2007, there was a social movement by lawyers of Pakistan that demanded a more independent judiciary. So the lower state wins we see after the reform may be explained by this social movement by lawyers. Now, to address this concern, I focus on the staggered implementation of the reform. New judicial appointments are staggered across space and time because there are limited vacancies in different districts and in different years. So for instance, in the city court of Peshawar, you had 90% of the judges already replaced and selected by Judicial Commission or Judge Peer appointees, relative to in the same year, in Sakhar, you had only 40% of the judges replaced and by Judge Peers. So we can exploit this space-time variation in a difference and differences framework, where on the left-hand side, we have the state victory variable at the case level. And on the right-hand side, we have the fraction of judges appointed by Judge Peers in 2010 interacted with the post-reform dummy. We can add district by bench fixed effects, time fixed effects, case type fixed effects, list of case characteristics and district characteristics controls. Alpha will be the difference and differences estimator for the effect of selection reform on state victories. However, alpha does not necessarily give us the causal effect of selection reform on state victories. And there is a really brilliant paper by Anandi Mani and Lakshmi A.R. for the case of India, where basically they show that even though Indian politicians cannot dismiss the bureaucrats, the threat of a transfer or a reassignment to an alternative district allows them to exert substantial control over the bureaucrats. So there is a very real concern here of post-appointment transfers, that basically the president pressurized the state chief justice, who is responsible for postings and transfers, to basically transfer the judges, causing sorting of judges into less independent and high independent districts, reintroducing an endogeneity problem. Now, to talk to this point, I suggest a new identification strategy. And to explain this identification strategy, I think this figure is helpful. So imagine that there are two districts, and in each of these two districts, there are two judges. Now, imagine that in District 2, Judge D at T is equal to 1 reaches her mandatory retirement age of 62 and is replaced by Judge E. Now, the fact that Judge D reached his 62nd birthday in District 2 and not in District 1 is plausibly orthogonal to case characteristics here, or district characteristics. But what it is correlated is first his birthday and new judicial appointments. So I instrument the fraction of judges appointed by judge peers by fraction of judges reaching their 62nd birthday and estimate kappa. Now for kappa, to give us the causal effect of selection reform, still we need to think about two key assumptions which any instrumental variable strategy relies on. First, of course, it's instrument relevance. Is the exogenous variable correlated with the endogenous variable? Here we find that mandatory retirements are highly correlated with new judicial appointments, where there is such an overlap that you can't even see some of the times that they are exactly the same. Second, there is no evidence of, so the second condition is, of course, instrument orthogonality. The evidence is consistent with it that our instrument is uncorrelated with the long list of case characteristics or district characteristics. But what it is correlated with is state victories, where we see that a 10% increase in judges appointed by judge peers reduces state victories by about 2 percentage points. This is a qualitatively large effect and equivalent to about 4% decrease in state wins over the sample mean. Now, what is also interesting and I think important to note is this is unlikely to be just the new guy effect, a new girl effect, where new judges are being compared with old judges. Because if you just see mandatory retirements, for example, in 2009, that was also accompanied by new judicial appointments. But these new judicial appointments were made by the president. Here we see that there is almost no effect of mandatory retirements per se on state wins. And if there is an effect, there is a small effect which might go into the opposite direction, meaning that these new judges are more likely to be pro-state or beholden to the state than judges who are older, who may want to leave a legacy, for example. So one thing is that in all the cases which we look at, where we look at mandatory retirements, we find that there is no effect when president is replacing the judges, but when mandatory retirement switches on, when the judge peers are selecting the judges, suddenly there is a negative effect on the state.
Sultan, sorry to interrupt, but there is a clarifying question from Claudio that I think it's worth taking a look, and so we can give you a little bit time extra from the Q&A, because I think this is important. So Claudio is confused about why the outcome is that the treatment is at the district level, while you seem to be able to have case level data and match to judges. So what's special about that? And I also had another clarifying question. I mean, retirement in 2009 would be correlated to retirement in 2010, in the sense that since you have a panel, why is it so special to look at 2010 other than at any given time, what is the fraction of judges that have been presidentially appointed? So I think that these two clarifying questions were worth enough to interrupt.
Okay, sure. Thanks for these questions. So the first question is, so I look at many different level of granularities this specification. So in particular, I have three level of granularity. So one is here, which I presented, is like the district time level, but there is my baseline specification, in fact, is at the bench level, where basically I am comparing districts which receive more judges in a given bench in a given district, and then see the effect in that bench, whether the case is in favor of the state or not. So it is not exactly aggregated at the district level, it's district aggregated within a district in a bench. So there are 4 benches in every district where the case involves the state. And this is my level of granularity which I'm looking at. So the case and the case fixed effect, which I'm saying I add, is not case fixed effect, I said case type fixed effect. So dummy for different case types. Maybe that was creating the confusion. Okay, so second is on 2009, whether there is a correlation on with 2009 and 2010. So what exactly I'm doing, maybe this thing will illustrate this point actually exactly. So what is the research design doing? This slide was added to make sure that the design is a bit more clear, because I get that usually it's not clear so far. So what am I doing? I am basically using mandatory retirements as an exogenous source of variation. So I am comparing two benches basically. So two courts where, and the pro-government rulings in these two courts. The control court is the judge turned 62 in 2009, and the replacement is chosen by the president. And the treated court is a judge turned 62, and the replacement is chosen by the Judicial Commission. So these two courts, the fact that different judges will reach their 62nd birthday in this 2009 and 2010 are not correlated, because this is determined by the age structure of judges. So basically, I'm using an age distribution in a way to estimate the effect of mandatory retirement. So if we go even further and think, if all the judges were appointed by judge peers, we would have a state wins to fall by 20 percentage points or a 40% decrease over the placebo mean. The reason why we can say that is actually, if you do a over time variation, and if you look in the end in 2019, you have almost all judges replaced. So you can actually kind of say that as well in another specification. Yeah. So what about differential trends? Here, basically, I was actually struggling to most transparently study differential trends in this context. And until I read Monica's paper, which actually this differential trend is completely exactly a replication of differential trends of our econometrica paper, where basically here I'm saying that district benches, where you had a lot of mandatory retirements in 2009, in 2010, the reform year, were they already on a different trajectory before the reform? So what I find here is that, in fact, there is a sharp fall only after the reform. So district benches which got more 62nd birthdays were not already on a different trajectory before the reform. But after the reform, we see kind of a permanent persistent effect. And also this is consistent with a lot of anecdotal evidence that reform was implemented in a hurry. This is one of the most prominent journalists in all Pakistan. He's banned now, but yeah. Second, also this reform was also done in complete secrecy because there was a huge potential for sabotage. So these are two reasons which are consistent with this sudden fall, which means that the reform came as a sudden shock to the system, where a committee of 6 politicians basically thought of this reform and pushed through this reform in 4 days, basically. So I won't have time to go through the details of the mechanisms, but I want to at least give you a flavor of what I do in the mechanism. So there are 4 questions I ask in my investigation of mechanism. First, what kind of cases are driving this? These turn out to be cases involving land expropriation by the state mostly, where a 10% increase in judges appointed by judge peers reduces cases involving land expropriation. State wins in cases involving land expropriation by about 3 percentage points, which is about 5% decrease over the placebo mean. Is this an improvement in the quality of judicial decisions? I think I made a rather bold statement that this makes the fall in state wins is an improvement in quality of judicial decisions, and I want to justify why I made it. So, of course, there can be cases where when the state is basically losing more, it's bad for its welfare reducing. But there is so much evidence which is to the contrary. First, I think one of the most powerful evidence for me is that case delay falls. So case delay is one of the biggest problems of countries like Pakistan. On average, a case takes 4 years to be decided, and 50% of the cases take 10 years, over 10 years to be decided. So if you have any fall in case delay, it's likely to be a good thing, and where I find that especially the right end of the distribution of the cases falls. So cases which were taking very long take lesser time. So specifically about not too much, but 10% increase in judges appointed by judge peers reduces case delay by about 2 months. So judge peers are faster. But this doesn't come at the expense of quality of judicial decision. So again, I bring on these lawyers who were rating state wins and ask them to rate the case also on due process of law and whether the decision was made on evidence and merits of the case. Both of them, by the way, was suggested by them is how they assess the quality. So what I find is that judge peers are also more likely to issue decisions on merits of the case relative to legal lacunae or technicalities which the presidential appointees are doing. And also they are rated highly on following due process of law. Coming to what kind of case judges are driving the results, I look at a lot of judge characteristics and I find that these judges are similar in a lot of things. So for example, their appointment age is similar. Both of them are appointed like when they're about 55. A lot of their gender ethnicities are similar for presidential appointees and judge peers, but they do differ in one key way, and that is political activity prior to the judicial appointment. Judges appointed by judge peers are 35% less likely to have ever run for district, national, or provincial elections than judges appointed by the president, suggesting that there is something that, so again, this is based on a lot of anecdotal evidence and legal scholarship that the selection reform makes is to select less politically loyal judges. Finally, of course, the estimates at the back of the envelope estimates suggest that the presidential appointment of judges leads to an additional land expropriation worth 0.14% of GDP, or about $400 million US dollars every year. Coming to the conclusion. Now, these are two judges. Both of these two judges are from my hometown of Lahore, and they are still serving. And what I want to say is that this is Justice Khan, he's appointed by the president. This is Justice Mirza, he's appointed by the judges. What my paper is basically saying is that when on Monday, Justice Mirza will go again to rule, he will be more likely to disallow the government to win cases, particularly in land expropriation cases. He will take less time to rule over a case. And judges like Justice Mirza will be more likely to issue rulings based on evidence of the case as opposed to legal lacunae and technicalities. So in the end, I just want to bring your attention to the case which I began with, where one of the most powerful political leaders, the business tycoon Nawaz Sharif, was dismissed from office as the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Now, this case was decided in 2017. My data ends in 2016. So you can, to me, when I looked it up, I found that all the 5 judges who gave a unanimous 5-0 verdict against the Prime Minister were selected by judge peers. So you can think of this as an out of sample prediction, but of one data point, of course. And if you still don't believe me, maybe you'll believe the person who was ousted from office by the judges, and he also blames the selection procedure, where he says that he will change the process to appoint judges if he's ever re-elected. Thank you very much.